Good morning, everybody. I hope you've all been having a very successful conference so far. It's been great for me. As you can hear, I've lost my voice. That means I've obviously been doing lots of good communication here, or I've been singing too much with the polyphonic band on Tuesday evening. Hopefully you won't have to hear from my voice too much today, because we have some really great speakers up here on the panel with me. I will be introducing them very shortly. But before I do that, I just wanted to thank you all for taking the time to join us this morning. Because I know that there's a lot of very interesting sessions going in parallel. I think if I wasn't moderating this one, I would be having a hard time choosing between them. So thank you very much for choosing us. Hopefully it will be very much worth your while. My name is Andrea Hampton, and I lead the WCO's, the World Customs Organization's integrity work. The World Customs Organization is an intergovernmental organization that represents 186 countries' customs administrations. And those customs administrations process more than 98% of the world's global trade. So today we're going to be looking at what happens when those global supply chains themselves are corrupted. And given that customs plays an integral role in those global supply chains, it's no surprise really that customs officers might be among the first that come to mind when we think about corruption in trade. And in fact, I think one of the earliest examples of human written communication was somebody complaining about a corrupt customs officer. So it's certainly been on humanity's radar for a while. Of course, corruption in supply chains doesn't only happen to customs officers or among customs officers, but we're certainly among the most visible. And given customs' critical and multifaceted role in societies, from collecting revenues to protecting people from harmful goods, to facilitating trade and keeping economic engines running, corruption in customs is clearly a socioeconomic problem and has quite a significant impact on societies. And this fact is, of course, well recognized by the WCO and its members, and a number of different measures have been taken in response. The WCO's Integrity Subcommittee is a forum for members to come together and share experiences, practices, and work together to identify effective anti-corruption measures. The WCO's key policy documents on this topic, the WCO Revised Arusha Declaration concerning good governance and integrity in customs, essentially says there's no magic bullet that customs administrations can use. They must tackle the issue holistically. And the WCO's anti-corruption and integrity promotion program for customs facilitates peer-to-peer technical assistance and capacity building that focuses on concrete anti-corruption initiatives that are within the power of a head of customs to make. So while taking a closer look at what leads to corruption in customs specifically, we're also able to see that the issue is obviously much more complex than customs officers simply being greedy. Customs officers face unique pressures, often working in remote environments. Sometimes their lives and livelihoods are on the line, and where the context and interaction with other key actors or enablers in the supply chain can have a big impact on individual decisions and behaviors. Organized criminal groups recognize and exploit these vulnerabilities. It's with that recognition in mind that we wanted to pull together some knowledgeable people working in parallel on different parts of these complex global supply chains, and gain from them a richer view of the harmful impact of corruption, in particular as linked to organized crime. Allow me now to introduce our speakers. And I'm going to ask each of you to share with me a little bit about your organization and its interest in this topic, just so that everybody in the room is on the same page with your perspective and where you're coming from as we get into the meat of our discussion today. So I think first I'll pick on Christina Amahauser. Christina is a senior analyst working at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime. She's working with their flagship environmental crime project, EcoSolve, and she leads the work stream there on corruption. She also co-leads the organization's work on illicit financial flows. And previous to that, she worked with the Global Initiative's Observatory of Illicit Economies in the Asia-Pacific and was responsible for overseeing programming in Southeast Asia, as well as civil society, government, and multilateral engagement in the region. Christina, could you please share with the audience today a little bit more about the Global Initiative's view and interest in corruption in global supply chains?
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Andrea, and thank you very much for the invitation to join this panel here today. So just very briefly, the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organized Crime is a civil society organization headquartered in Geneva, Switzerland, and we work on issues related to illicit economies and organized crime. We can conduct research and analysis on the topic. We promote dialogue, debate, and raise awareness around the impacts and harms on communities around the world. And we work on the building blocks of a global strategy against transnational organized crime, finding innovative responses to the topic specifically with civil society. And we do so through our Resilience Fund, which is a grant-making mechanism. We've looked at the role of ports quite a lot in our work, specifically in the Western Balkans, but also in West Africa, and I'm really looking forward to sharing some of our findings in this regard. Thanks.
Thank you, Christina. And next we're joined by Mr. Martin Bendersen from the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network. Martin, as an Associate Director for Collective Action for Partnership Development, is responsible for scaling MACN's collective action initiatives and for stewarding MACN's partnerships with international donor organizations. Martin joined the MACN Secretariat in 2014, so that's a good 10 years there, well known, I think, now, and has since catalyzed and led collective action initiatives to tackle corruption in the port and maritime sector in several countries. He currently oversees MACN's collective action initiatives in Indonesia and Malaysia, and has steered MACN's efforts to establish a global port integrity platform. Martin also provides oversight and ensures good governance of MACN's grant portfolio. Martin, could you share how specifically MACN's work relate to the topic of corruption in the global supply chain?
Yes, thank you for that, Andrea, and very good morning to all of you. So the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network is an industry-led collective action initiative where we are collaborating with the shipping industry, governments, and civil society to try and eliminate some of the root causes driving corruption in ports. This is an initiative that was established more than 10 years ago by a handful of shipping companies who wanted to take collective action against some of the corruption challenges, both on the private sector side in the supply chain, but also in the interface with governance. And specifically, there was a genuine frustration, I think, with the challenges that occur as ship goes into ports. There's a number of inspections and interactions that needs to happen, both with government, but also with local players from the supply chain. And sometimes these involve a number of risks in terms of bribery requests, extortion, and also small FPs. So I think there was a recognition that you cannot solve this on your own. You need a collective action platform. You need to work with your supply chain, local, global, as well as the government. And that was really how we came about. And over the years, we have grown to become a fairly large, specifically a fairly large private sector initiative in this field. We now have more than 220 companies in this platform. It's a member-based organization. And as a collective, we represent more than 50% of the global tonnage being transported at sea. And these numbers matters. It gives us a certain leverage, it gives us a certain voice as we enter into conversation with governments and also other private sector partners in ports and countries where we see opportunities and of course also challenges with maritime corruption and to drive change. So yeah, looking forward to talking more about how we actually work in the following discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. And next, back to the customs community, we have David Sain. David joined the Australian Border Force in 2000 and has held a variety of customs border enforcement capacity building and policy-based roles in Australia and abroad. More recently, David led national ABF team responsible for securing Australia's global cargo supply chain against infiltration by highly organised transnational crime groups. In January 2024, David joined the World Customs Organization as project manager for a global supply chain integrity project intended to build customs resilience in the international supply chain. David, I know I've already introduced to the audience what the World Customs Organization does, but could you please share a little bit more about the Supply Chain Integrity Project and the work that you're doing and interest in this topic?
Of course. Thanks, Andrea. And good morning, everyone, and thanks again for picking our session and joining us this morning. So the World Customs Organization, as you heard, has 186 members, and the organisation is really driven by those members. So if we rewind to a couple of years, 2022, the WCO hosted a meeting of the Enforcement Committee, which is a group that meets annually, and they deliberated and discussed what at that point in time was the most, I suppose, confronting risk facing us as an international customs community. And that was precisely criminals' infiltration of the international supply chain, their stronghold, and their ability to manipulate and manoeuvre quite freely in that supply chain, most notably to transport illicit narcotics. So it was raised at that forum and penciled as an action item, and a call for support went out to the membership. Fortunately, the Australian government answered that call, and that paved the way for the Supply Chain Integrity Project, which I'll talk to you about today, and which is the current project that I lead. Effectively, what it's about is building resilience for customs in the customs-controlled supply chain. And the word resilience has been used quite a lot throughout this week, and it seems to sort of be a buzzword of the modern day. For mine, it's a pretty simple definition, and we look at, in this project, building resilience. So my definition of resilience is having the ability to absorb criticism, adversity, failure, and stress, to absorb those and then to respond and to come out stronger. And that's basically the motto of our project, is building resilience for customs. I think I'll leave it there, and I'll talk a little bit more about the project throughout the morning session. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you, David. And finally, I'd like to introduce Jamie Bergen, who's a research coordinator at Transparency International's Anti-Corruption Help Desk. Prior to joining TI, Jamie worked at UNDP Kenya, where he supported projects on anti-corruption, electoral assistance, and strengthening the civic space. Jamie also worked at the permanent mission of Japan to UNODC, focusing on multilateral negotiations towards the Kyoto Crime Congress and Organised 2021. He also worked on anti-human trafficking agenda at the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Jamie, could you please share with us a brief snapshot of how Transparency International and the Help Desk in particular also is looking at this issue?
Yeah, thank you so much, Andrea, and good morning, everyone. I will spare you a general introduction to Transparency International, but I'd like to explain the kind of multiple entry points we have to this topic. We, for example, work on business integrity. We're looking at the private sector actors along the supply chain. Some of our chapters are doing great work in cooperation with national customs authorities. But mine is to really speak about the research angle. And the reason that we're so interested in this topic is it's really, what this appears to be quite a niche topic in one way, is actually what we see as the juncture that links corruption to a host of other transnational crimes as carried out by organized criminal groups. So that's why we were really happy when the World Customs Organization in cooperation with NORAD, reached out to the TI, U4, Anti-Corruption Help Desk. That's a service that we offer in which we respond to queries that are really coming from problems based on the ground relating to corruption. And Andrea, David, and the World Customs Authority organization reached out to us, and they had a set of questions which were really very pertinent at this moment of time. The first of which really was on this topic. It was really about how do organized criminal groups use both physical threats, the threat of violence, and corruption as tactics to corrupt supply chains. So I think I'll leave it for there for now, but I'll be happy to speak more about that paper in the course of today. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jamie. So I think, like you mentioned, it seems maybe at first a niche topic, but considering what I said, 98% of the world's trade goes through customs. Trade in itself, everything in our daily lives, our health, our education, our security, at some point or other has had some contact to connect with the global trade environment and the physical movement of goods. So with that in mind, and sort of stepping back and seeing this bigger picture, I'd like to start this day's discussions by looking at that wider scale and global scope of the problem from a wide-angle view in terms of global trends in the markets and criminality and the impact in general. So, Christina, if we may start with you. Based on the Global Initiative's global research of various illicit markets and their interlinkages, sorry, that's not part of the question. What have your findings been with regards to transnational organized crimes, corruption of supply chains?
Thanks, Andrea. Are you guys okay? Good. So I think we've already heard it in the introductions that corruption really plays a key role in enabling and driving organized crime at really each step of the supply chain. And for the conference and the panel here today, I thought I'd illustrate this very briefly by using one case study from a research that we've done that looked at trafficking of abalone from South Africa to Hong Kong. So just very briefly, as an introduction, abalone is a marine snail that is traded live, fresh, canned, dried, and frozen, actually. And while there's no distinction is made between the different abalone species, we see that consumers continue to demand wild abalone over those that are grown in agricultural farms. And one of the few places where abalone still grows in the wild is South Africa. And given that harvesting quotas in South Africa have been reduced, but demand remains high, this has resulted in massive poaching, possibly to a point of no return. And the snail is often trafficked to Hong Kong, which is a big consumer market, but it's also the global epicenter of the abalone trade and distribution hub to China, as well as to Southeast Asia. And I've picked this case study because I think it highlights really 4 key points that are very relevant to the conversation. First, it maps out the criminal supply chain step by step and shows how corruption takes place at each step, actually. And so this ranges from low-level bribery to officials, really up to high-level protection and corruption. As the authors of the report have put it, there's evidence to suggest that in South Africa, every single government agency tasked with combating abalone poaching has been compromised to some degree by corruption linked to the illicit trade. And I think this also helps to explain how illicit activity can follow the same routes as the illicit trade. So then the second point is that the research maps out the money flows linked to illicit abalone trade and finds that at street levels, many payments remain cash-based. And so while the bulk of the profits are assumed to be made at the top in Hong Kong, the cash generated by poaching, drying, and selling the abalone product to Asian buyers has been substantial enough to generate large and highly competitive criminal market in South Africa. And so in short, even though the big money is actually made further down the supply chain, there's substantial incomes and bribe payments along the South African part of the value chain as well. And we found numerous points of convergence also with other illicit markets, be the at the bottom where the divers are paid, for example, in drugs, or along the supply chain where much of the working capital needed to pay the salaries and the bribes that enter South Africa also as drug imports, which then must be sold and converted into cash again. And so this also underlines for me that criminal markets don't operate in isolation. That brings me to the third reason why I thought this case study fit quite well, and that's because the research not only maps the infrastructure that plays a role in the illicit habit loan trade, that includes ports, but also road networks, but it also looks more broadly at the role of enablers, the lawyers, money movers, logisticians that facilitate the trade. And so the underworld can only really operate thanks to links in the upper world, and illicit economies seek efficiencies, and good infrastructure is good for business, for both illicit and licit business. And then that brings me also to the fourth point in relation to, and that's the harms associated with it. This includes poaching, corruption, violence, exploitation, and the strengthening of socially destructive organized crime groups like gangs. So, for example, we see increasing fragmentation in the abalone poaching economy, where new criminal players enter the market, which leads to increased violence through targeted assassinations and competition over turf. We also see that some of the damage inflicted on humans is driven by the policing of it, the criminalization of communities through the arrests of low-level perpetrators in the trade, which contributes to further impoverishment and puts strains on families. And these characteristics are also evident in other criminal markets, including the drug trade or illegal wildlife trade. And the list of harms is really much longer, and not only includes those that I've just mentioned, but also includes harms on the environment, as an ecosystem is put under pressure that also then has knock-on effects and so on. So I think this research on abalone really underlines that the harms need to be assessed very broadly, beyond the importance of the rule of law and which laws are actually broken, or to the formal economy in lost tax revenue and so on. The scope of harm needs to include damage to vulnerable and marginalized people in society, including the low-status participants in illicit economies. It also needs to include the harm inflicted on non-human entities, such as the environment. And we need to understand the ecosystem in which the crime takes place. Only going after the criminal groups without really shrinking the market or disrupting the enablers will have little long-term effect. And so just two quick last points before handing back to you. In our work, we've also started to look more at the role of elite protection and corruption in driving and enabling environmental crime, and look at the reasons why the laws are really never enforced or cases don't progress through the judicial system. And across our work, we've seen how business, criminal, and political elites are moving closer together, and the lines between the upper and the underworld are becoming more and more blurred. And we will see more of that, I think, when we also specifically talk about the role of ports in a second. And the second thing that really stands out is that we need to better understand how money moves in connection to all of this, and to broaden our understanding of the drivers and the enablers of illicit money flows. Illicit markets and actors take advantage of the informal economy. Offshore tax havens, special economic zones play a key role, which provide ample opportunities to move funds without oversight. And so I think we need to put more effort on understanding these licit enablers of illicit financial flows, the lawyers, notaries, and other facilitators of licit business who enable the movement of money. But yeah, over to you.
Thank you, Christina. I think it's, you've made, first of all, very clear the links between corruption and the criminality, and I think also just the complexity of all of the different actors and the activities that are happening in these illicit markets. It sort of also highlights a word I think we've heard quite a bit this week, the polycriminality of it as well. So they're very, very insightful. Thank you very much. Martin, does this tally with what you see in MACN's country initiatives or hear from ship captains and member companies of your network in terms of organized crime's impact and the linkages with corruption?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think, Christina, you gave a really nice picture of the entire supply chain and the societal impact of these challenges. I will, of course, now zoom into the port level and see what actually goes on there and what we see as the main challenges. And I think, firstly, the nature of maritime trade and port operation is fairly complex. If you look at one single ship going into a port, there are a number of stakeholders that must be involved just to make that ship enter the port. On the private sector side, you have, on average, 7 players involved. You have someone owning the vessel, someone owning the cargo, you have someone insuring the vessel, someone managing the ship, and you also have local SMEs in the port who manage that port call and help you through that inspection. So already there you have at least 7 players, global and local. On the government side, you have an equal number of players. You have 7 inspectors that need to come and check that vessel. This is customs, this is immigration, this is port authority, law enforcement, and a number of players that must do these inspections, digital or face-to-face, depending on where you're calling. So already here we have a fairly complex network of players and interactions that needs to happen just for one single ship. And I'm not talking about cargo here, I'm just talking about the ship. So that's a very important distinction. This is before even you touch the cargo. And what we see in our work is, of course, that you have a perfect scenario for extorting bribes from that ship. You have a high-value vessel, high-value cargo coming into a port, and you can delay that shipment in many ways, and that ship, and extract money. And that's what we see happening. You have both public and also private players using that opportunity to really extract the bribes. The nature of the corruption we see in ports is similar to what you just described here, Christina. It is organized. It's organized between the public and the private sector. So it's a semi-organized network where you're colluding to share the gains of these corruption schemes, for example, between port agents and customs, and they run these schemes together. And also to kind of reiterate what you say, this comes with sanctions from the top. When you try and go to the root cause and how is that actually set up, it's being upheld through sometimes ministry level sanctions or also senior level private sector involvement to some extent. And we've seen this in our work, for example, where we try to see progress and have one single agency in the port to say no to corruption and get rid of these bad apples, the inspectors that are running these schemes on the ground. And we think it's really good news. They are debarring the inspectors. There's new regulation coming. But in a couple of months, you have the same inspectors reappearing in another government agency, and they continue doing the same kind of scheme, the same kind of money, but for the environmental agency, just as an example. And again, this leads to the conclusion that there is something here at the top that kind of orchestrates this. Another more sophisticated way to maintain these schemes is to use also the national institutions. One is through, for example, the court system. So you could have corrupt judges that are issuing fraudulent detention claims on ships. And when you detain the ship, you take the ship. And now all of a sudden you have the perfect weapon to extract even more bribes from that ship, because you're actually in a hostage situation. You're in a foreign country and you have a court order to detain your ship, but there is of course a solution to that. You can pay this kind of money and that detention will all of a sudden go away. So this is just some of the scenarios that we see play out in ports across the world. And I think the point I'm trying to make here that it's complex in the sense that you have public and private sector colluding and collaborating. It operates at multiple levels and it comes with power. It finds ways to maintain these schemes by involving government institutions and of course the business side. So you need to find ways to break down these networks. And we have some quite brilliant examples from Latin America, for example, where we have formed these collective action alliances with the industry, with the government, business associations and civil society to really drive reforms and find the champions of change to break down these illicit networks. In Argentina, for example, we broke down or dismantled a network worth about $30 million a year in bribes that was being extracted from ships exporting grains out of Argentina. Now, what is the connection to organized crime? Well, to be honest, I don't have the answer because we don't deal directly with organized crime. I only have anecdotal findings, and I think one of those anecdotal findings is that as you compare the maps of our work and where we see prevalence of corruption in ports, if you put that map on top of maps and data on where illicit trade and also organized crime is present, there is somewhat of a match. So I think it's likely to assume that organized crime, they do find the regions, the ports where governance is weaker, where corruption thrives, and I'm sure there are also attempts by organized crime to undermine the efforts we're all trying to make to combat corruption in these locations. So the locations I'm talking about are oftentimes remote ports, remote regions from the capital, border regions, and so on. So you probably understand what I'm pointing at. So I think this is something we are keen to explore, and what we can add to this conversation is really the data understanding of where corruption thrives in ports, how it operates, and to some extent also why it thrives in the ports.
Thank you, Martin. I think, as we had heard from Christina about the complexity in multiple criminal acts, and then that means, of course, we have multiple impact levels as well. I think what you've outlined here is that it's also incredibly complex in terms of the layers and the multi-layered nature of it. But, I think even though, as you say, sort of the links between organized crime and what you're seeing and experiencing through your network. As you said, it's anecdotal, but I think just the networks that you're describing, these multi-layered networks, as you say, they're organized. So that's, to me, that's organized crime and organized criminality of a point. So recognizing also, of course, the public-private sector interaction, customs being certainly a part of that. David, I know the ABF WCO Supply Chain Integrity Project has started looking into responses to this issue, specifically how can customs resist and respond to being party to these criminal networks. Can you share a little bit more about the experiences that have informed your approach?
Of course, thank you. So I think the first point to make is we've spoken about organised crime groups, but really trying to define just how diverse and sophisticated they now are. So once upon a time, when you're assessing risks that presented international borders, the equation was much simpler. You would look at a high-risk region or a supply region, for example, in the case of illicit narcotics trafficking, and you would build risk assessment criteria and selectivity criteria to make those selections based on sort of known variables. Essentially, that's what risk assessment at international borders is about. Now it's a very different scenario. Fast forward 2 decades, crime groups are a lot more diverse, and I speak in the context of illicit trafficking of narcotics, and they're more sophisticated. So once upon a time, a criminal element working in, say, Central and South America, focused on their region, focused on supply and demand, meeting demand from their region. Now it's almost convergences of multiple crime groups working together to maximise their profits. In much the same way we're convening here over this week as an international community to talk about corruption and other things. Crime groups are very much taking that same approach where they're combining resources, combining effort, energy, and basically converging. So they're more sophisticated, they're more diverse. Next point I'll make is the prolific and systemic infiltration of air and seaports around the world. So we know for a fact, and this is quite available on open source reporting, many of the world's ports, particularly the maritime ports, are heavily compromised by crime groups. And we heard Christina mention this morning the term enabler. And quite frequently over this week, we've heard about enablers and we've heard about facilitators. In our world, we refer to them as internal conspirators. Effectively, those three are interchangeable. So a facilitator, enabler, and internal conspirator. The best definition I can give you on an internal conspirator or an enabler is someone who is granted privileged access to a corporate system, a corporate asset, inside knowledge or intimate knowledge of the way or the inner workings of a business operation. Now, these terms aren't confined to the supply chain and they're certainly not confined to the logistics sector. They apply to pretty much any business operation. So again, back to our world, internal conspirators. I thought it'd be a good opportunity just to spend a little bit of time talking about them and to explain the people, I suppose, and the jobs that we're interested in. So if we could go to the first slide, please. Okay, so this is unrehearsed, by the way. The introductions that were given by Christina and Martin are a perfect sort of introduction to what I'll talk about. And again, unrehearsed, it just worked out that way, which is nice. So number one, the internal conspirators that are perhaps most prolific are those that work in airport and seaport environments. Baggage handlers, catering crew, airline staff, merchant vessel crew members, ground staff, pretty much anyone that is granted access to an air or seaport. In this example, in number one, you can see a container from Brazil, seized by Brazilian authorities, that was loaded with a quite significant amount of cocaine. Now, this is a legitimate container that was going from a legitimate exporter to a legitimate importer that had actually no knowledge of what was going on, but it was targeted for contamination based on its particular routing. And that's what internal conspirators in the port environment do. They look at routing, they look at where containers move, and when there is a match in the routing of that container, in terms of matching where a crime group want the narcotics to be distributed, they will quite readily access and infiltrate and contaminate that container. The other picture is of an air cargo baggage handler at Sydney Airport, involved in the import of 100 kilos of cocaine from South Africa. So whilst internal conspirators are an issue for the receiving port, they're just as much as an issue for the sending port. So in this case, it was a pretty sophisticated network working out of South Africa that contaminated an air cargo consignment that was then retrieved in Sydney. 5 people were arrested and the 100 kilos was seized. So that's probably the biggest impact we're seeing is people that work in port limits or port environments and air cargo environments. Next is drops at sea. So this again involves merchant vessel crew mainly, who will get to a certain point along their voyage, literally throw narcotics into the water on floating devices to then be retrieved by a shore party. This example is over 3 tonnes that was picked up by New Zealand police. That amount of narcotics would supply New Zealand's illicit narcotics market for over 30 years. So obviously not intended just for distribution in New Zealand. It was wider distribution in and around the Pacific, but picked up by law enforcement and taken out of circulation. Quite common. We're seeing this more and more in and around the Pacific particularly. Next are underhull attachments. This is a really difficult one for law enforcement to pick up on. So this is internal conspirators or enablers working to contaminate vessels beneath the waterline, and it's usually a parasitic attachment which is affixed to the hull of a vessel, or it's contamination into what's called the sea chest. The sea chest is basically the inlet that allows water to pass into a merchant vessel. In this example, it's the Hellenic Coast Guard in Greece that through a dive on a vessel, recovered a couple of 100 kilos of cocaine that was secreted into the sea chest. And finally, again, unrehearsed, you heard Martin talk about the risk of remote ports. It's very much a risk from the customs perspective because of the limited presence of law enforcement at the remote ports. Crime groups are well aware of that limited presence and use the opportunity to come in and infiltrate and contaminate and retrieve narcotics from remote ports. So that's just a little bit of a snapshot of the issues that confront us as an international customs community. We're in a very privileged access point from a customs perspective, in that most of our members are extended laws, powers that allow us to search, seize, detain pretty much any conveyance and any cargo that enters into the supply chain. And that's pretty much what we're looking at. When a consignment leaves to the point that it arrives, who's involved, how are they involved, and how are they likely to be manipulating the system to further the ventures of organised crime groups. So if we move to the next slide, I will now just try and quantify the extent of the problem. So we're talking about the illicit narcotics trade, and just take a moment to look at those statistics. These are live statistics taken over the last 4 weeks. So I tried to provide a snapshot just to show the extent of the problem that's confronting us. just keep in mind that I only stopped populating this slide because I ran out of room. I could have populated another 3 slides quite easily, just because of just over the course of the last 4 weeks, and that's only what's reported to us at the Secretariat. So that means that this is what's been seized. So the amount that hasn't been seized and hasn't been reported is substantially higher. So just to give you some perspective, one, on the quantities that are being moved, the illicit quantities of narcotics, predominantly cocaine, that are being moved around the world as we speak, but also the countries that are impacted. So you can see the range of countries and ports that are being infiltrated and are being used to move these narcotics around the world. And again, the list is a lot higher than that. This is really just a snapshot to give you that perspective. So why is this happening? It's quite simple. And again, over the course of this week, we heard about crime groups being profit-driven enterprise. And it's just a supply and demand equation. There is a hell of a lot of supply, particularly of cocaine at the moment. Production in the main hubs that produce cocaine is thriving. And there's an equal amount of demand. It's an insatiable appetite at the moment, seemingly. And countries are quite happy to pay a lot of money. So the profit margins are from the point of origin to the point of distribution at a wholesale level. It's a very highly lucrative market. And you'll see a quote there on the right-hand side from the intelligence community, and I echo that sentiment. And in 25 years of working in customs and border protection, the problem now is as bad as it's ever been. So again, back to our project, that's what we're trying to highlight, is the extent of the issue, but we're also trying to put in actual, tangible mitigation strategies for the customs community and our 186 members, and to hopefully putting a bit of a dent into criminal enterprise and their stronghold on the international supply chain. I think in the interest of time, I'll leave it there. Back to you, thank you.
Thank you, David. Just going back to Christina, if you don't mind, Jamie, for a moment before we hear from you. Just in general then, what threats and challenges do you see for ports and customs and other actors in particular along the international supply chain due to organised crime and corruption? And what are the links between them?
Thank you. And so building on what David also just said before on the role of enablers or internal conspirators, I think that's an interesting term, and illicit flows, we've really looked specifically at the role of ports and the criminal supply chain, and I thought I could share a little bit more about that. I think one point highlighting up front, maybe that's very specific to environmental crime, and the case study that I talked about earlier is that the environmental commodities are often legal, that they're often legal and illegal forms of extraction and use. And so this requires really a functioning permit system and the use of quotas, etc. But also for port officials actually to know about these environmental commodities and what is legal and what is illegal and how. And this would include information on what documents each commodity needs to be exported and who is actually able to issue such documents as well. And here's something, a point where we see significant capacity gaps, and there are also then, of course, that creates significant opportunities for corruption. But turning to the role of ports more widely, I think it's worth acknowledging that given that they're very closed, often restricted areas, many ports almost function like little ecosystems in and by themselves. And in terms of understanding corruption, this is important because, as also was mentioned before, there's sort of corruption when it relates to the boat itself, to the port itself, and then again the transportation and everything that comes after. And Martin, you've already started talking about the risks that relate to ports, but like drawing on some of the studies that were conducted in Western Europe and North America, ports show that shows that their exposure to criminal infiltration and exploitation is directly proportional also to the advantages of increased seaborne transportation. So the bigger the port and the role it plays in international maritime trade, and the larger the number of containers passing through it annually, the more opportunities for criminal groups to hide in smuggling goods. I think that's actually not a big surprise. Rotterdam and Antwerp, the busiest ports in Europe, are really good examples here. But you've also mentioned that some of the smaller ports, for example, we've seen that in the Balkans, but it's also relevant elsewhere. Smaller ports with weaker security measures can also be attractive to criminal groups. where state-run ports are used by influential figures in the security sector with close links to businesses and political elites to smuggle goods. There's a risk of captured ports. We also see that small ports are more significant if they're close to landlocked countries. As a result, small ports can take an important disproportionate to their size, including for illicit flows. So some more risk factors that can help determine why ports are more attractive to crime groups include the governance or jurisdictional structure, so what actors are responsible for security in the port and who they're connected with, the port administration, it's been mentioned, who owns the port, what business entities actually operate within it, the physical structure of the port, the presence of natural barriers and all that, as well as the safety precautions. Of course, the security provisions at a port, such as fences, CCTV cameras, underwater drones, etc. The procedures used to identify and mitigate such risks also play a role. Another critical factor to consider is the port's proximity to criminal networks, and that then really requires understanding the port's commercial structure and profile, the cargo trade routes in relation to what kind of criminal actors and markets are active in the vicinity. It's also important to understand the flows coming into the port. So are goods coming from certain countries, using certain shipping or container companies with certain risk factors. I think we've already mentioned that there's only really a small percentage of containers that we can scan, but more effective risk profiling and cooperation between ports and the private and public sectors can increase the chances of sort of finding the needle in the haystack. One factor which really stands out from our perspective as well and deserves particular attention is the role of trade zones, special economic zones within ports, which along with privacy jurisdictions and tax havens have significantly reduced the ability of governments to regulate the smuggling of licit and illicit goods. And we see this massive explosion of free trade zones around the world from like 170 something in the mid-80s to more than 5,000 these days, with the biggest number in Asia. And these special economic zones where oversight and regulation is really poor can offer an ideal entry point for bleeding licit and illicit goods together. And some of these special economic zones are run by governments, some are run by the private sector, some jointly, and they really facilitate trade by providing advantages to businesses in respect of tariffs, financing, ownership, taxes, and requirements to transparency and other regulatory measures that would typically be applicable. So within the special economic zones, national laws are suspended in favor of agreements for governing that zone. And I think a study by the OECD has shown that with each additional special economic zone, this increases the total value of fake goods in an economy. So it's quite significant. So entire service industries exist along drug trafficking, combining protection and management of illicit assets. And corruption is really a well-known enabler for all of these things, just to underline that again. And responses in terms of legislation, security, equipment, and cooperation agreements become really irrelevant when corruption has occurred. And so I think that then I'll stop here, but it really goes back to also what we've started out by saying, that really cross-sectoral cooperation between all these actors is so important.
Thank you, Christina. Now, finally, Jamie, I know that we talked about the research that your help desk, the TI's help desk has been doing with regards to the shape of organised crime and its tactics, and in particular the study that you did for us, how it infiltrates customs and other actors as well along the supply chain. Could you share a bit more about your findings with us?
Yeah, thank you very much, Andrea. Yeah, it really comes back to this word tactic. I mean, corruption is used as a tactic to help organized criminal groups enable their profit-making activities. That's trafficking in narcotics, it's environmental crime. But organized criminal groups are unique in that they have another tactic available. They are willing to threaten or exert violence. And what we found in this TI U4 help desk paper, and you can read this online, it's available on both of our websites, is that this interplay between corruption and violence makes it a bit more difficult, a bit more intricate to try to tackle that corruption. And I'll go into that in detail now. I apologize, it will get a bit theoretical, but I think this reflects an important point, which is we need to try to get into the mind of the organized criminal group, the bribe giver, and we need to trying to get it into the mind of the customs official, the bribe taker, to understand what makes them tick. And I do have a visual aid that should be able to help, so if you could please put up the slide. Thank you. So what this process flow really just shows is how, again, this organized criminal group, a typical organized criminal group, might get to reach its goal, how it might corrupt, for example, a customs official. And what we find is in many settings, when you consider both of these tactics, corruption as opposed to violence, they will first try corruption because it's less risky in terms of it normally will attract less attention from law enforcement. It can be done behind the scenes, etc. But what we find is if it becomes no longer possible for them to exert or to engage in corruption, to corrupt the official, for example, due to a successful anti-corruption measure, they either have two choices, and this is where the middle of the diagram goes. They will either give up their goal, they will withdraw, but as we know, these are extremely profit-heavy activities, so it's unlikely in many cases. What they might do is to decide to threaten violence, go for the same customs official, and take that higher risk, but employ physical threat against them. And why I say this is extremely challenging for us in the anti-corruption community, because we've spoken a lot this week about unintended consequences of our interventions. And this just means that we need to be extremely conscious that anti-corruption interventions themselves can have such consequences. And what's required is like an enhanced risk-adverse approach, which I'd like to go into later, more or less. But then from the other point of view, in terms of the individual, let's say the customs official, we also want to understand what's going on in their minds. And it doesn't really make sense to differentiate between corruption and violence. What we're finding, when we've done a big survey mapping of evidence from media reports, from academic literature, is what comes up again and again is that they say, when we are being offered a bribe, we feel an implicit threat because we know that this actor, this organized criminal group, could at one stage enact exact violence against us or threaten our families and so forth. So we tend to try to think in the anti-corruption world about corruption as something about self-enrichment, violence about something as like self-preservation. But here we see them very interlinked and it becomes a little hard to disentangle. And that's important because on the one hand, you have to think about how do you negate the threat of violence when the person is being offered the bribe? But also, if they decide to exit the engagement in corruption, what does the exit strategy look like when it could mean that they actually might face repercussions from the organized criminal group themselves and their families? So again, I think I'll stop there for now, but I will go into more. What we're thinking about is more enhanced integrity measures, not a completely different approach, but ways that are more risk-adverse that basically address both those separate threats, but in a unified way. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. I think you've pointed out that the risks that we need to look at are broader, and there's many more angles that need to be attended to in this. And I think it's a point that I think all our speakers have made. Maybe back to you, David, because you mentioned risk management as sort of one of the core pieces of work that you're promoting. So along this lines and other measures that can be promoted in the Supply Chain Integrity Project, can you share a bit more about what we can actually do in response?
Sure, thanks, Andrea. So I think if I just take a reflection from across the community, I think law enforcement collaboration is big, is key. Early warning systems, for want of better terminology. So particularly across the intelligence fraternity. So when officers deploy into an unknown environment, they generally will undertake some sort of risk assessment, and that risk will look at the actual environment, the potential people involved, and the likely interactions that they're having. So having knowledge of that unknown environment to every extent possible helps aid in the risk assessment, and then it better informs you if you're potentially entering into a hostile situation, or someone who has negative sentiments towards law enforcement, or someone who's prone to violence, or someone who has firearms permits and licenses. So I think law enforcement relations, that's outside of the customs community, broadly speaking, into the intelligence community and beyond, having those relationships and having the access to the intelligence is one such strategy. And I think just generally speaking about minimising organisational risk, because it is about organisational risk as well. A couple of things here. So internal integrity measures for the organisation. And two things that stand out that some of our members do really well are employment suitability clearances. So that looks at the individual, their likely financial patterns, even their driver history, their potential criminal associations, any conflicts of interest. So it enables a picture of the potential applicant, and the organisation will then implement some sort of assessment process to deem them unfit or otherwise for employment. But also a security clearance, which is different to an employment suitability. Security clearance looks at the integrity of the potential candidate and their trustworthiness. If you were to give them access to corporate systems and government data, how likely are they to use that in a responsible manner? So a combination of the two, I think, is really a really good way for the organisation to secure itself and provide a protection mechanism for itself. And I think just a very general one, officer safety. So some administrations have taken the decision to arm their officers, and that's a combination of firearms, oleoresin capsicum spray, for example, batons. And that's just another layer. It's almost a bit of a deterrent. Fortunately, we don't see too many instances of violence against customs officials, but I guess that's just one proactive measure that some administrations have taken in an effort to protect their workforce. So that's kind of a bit of a roundabout answer to the question, but I think I'll leave it there again.
Excuse me, I apologise. Maybe just same question to you.
Yeah, thanks for that, and thanks for that, David. What can we do to prevent this? Well, I mean, some of you in the audience may be thinking, why can't the private sector do more? Why can't you clean up your business, clean up your supply chain, and lead by example? And I think the answer is that some is being done. There are definitely responsible business out there who have protocols to prevent or avoid these situations, but it's not effective. And why is it not effective? Well, I think similar to corruption, organised crime is a multi-stakeholder and supply chain challenge. And you need to involve all players to be effective. Shipping and the shipping line is just one player in that supply chain. And they are just one piece of the puzzle here. And sometimes they're not even directly involved. You may have importers, freight forwarders, and so on who actually plant this cargo on board. Let me tell you just a short story and what companies are actually doing. We had a member company who got caught in a illicit trade case in Latin America a few years back. The captain was put in jail for 2 years. The ship was, of course, detained. It took 2 years to clear him from any kind of suspicion, and he was freed. As well as the company, they were not involved in this case. There was someone who came on board his ship and planted these drugs. It was quite a substantial amount of cocaine. Using tactics like you just showed on your screen. I think that was really good. This company, they already had a fairly robust protocol to try and avoid these things. And you need to imagine here, it's a big commercial vessel coming into a port in Latin America. The crew on that ship, there's not that many people, but you still have, of course, a responsibility to secure that vessel, make sure that no one comes on board and so on. So what you use is, of course, surveillance. You use CCTV, you have drones, you have divers, you use sniffer dogs to go through the ship at multiple times. Still, this didn't help. Someone came on board, they planted these drugs. And part of the answer is that, well, probably the security in the port facility is not up to standards. You may have unauthorized staff coming to access that port. And there is currently, I think, some important work being done at the IMO, for example, to look at how can we improve the standards on security in ports. And this, again, is something that a shipping company cannot really have any authority over. They manage the ship. But from our perspective, security and surveillance is really not the silver bullet to this. It's not the silver bullet to corruption. And I would say it's probably not the one solution to organized crime either. In the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network, we have conducted a piece of research 3 years ago, working with a number of universities to assess the integrity performance of ports worldwide. So we looked at 250 ports, going through all the key agencies in this port, not just customs, but port authorities, the private terminals and so on. And to say, so what kind of policies, procedures and systems do you have in place to actually prevent corruption from happening? And there is nothing new here. This is just the basic stuff. Like, do you have compliance programs? Is there an ethics program? Is there a code of ethics? Do you train your staff? Do you have whistleblowing systems? Do you have appeal mechanism and make your procedures transparent to the business sector and public and so on? So we did that assessment and we put that into a data platform that we call the Global Port Integrity Platform, which is essentially a benchmark tool where you can go in and benchmark the integrity performance of ports and see where are the high-risk ports, where are the high-risk stakeholders in that port and so forth. So it's an excellent tool for the industry to understand where do I have risk, and it's an excellent tool for us to drive engagement with government and say, this is our data, can we actually try and you know, move the needle here and get you up to this level, because these ports are not working that well, while you have these ports at a substandard level and so forth. So very helpful tool, but the finding was also not so encouraging, because about 50% of these ports had any kind of systems in place. 50% of the ports had an anti-corruption policy, and I'm talking about all the stakeholders in the port, like port authorities, customs, immigration. 46% of the ports had whistleblowing systems, and about 50% had an appeal and grievance mechanism. So for us, our agenda is to say that, well, there is not enough attention to good governance in port, and there is really some homework to be done by both governments and private terminals to invest more in, I would say, the basic governance that you would expect of any organization, to build integrity into that organization. So that's one thing we would like to see, and this is something we advocate for as we engage with the ports and terminal community. Another point, what we see as a good tool, and I think it's kind of allude to what you said about law enforcement, is to promote interagency collaboration between government agencies. And what that means in practice is that you bring all these key agencies in the port. I spoke about 7 agencies in the beginning. You bring them together in one platform, one team, and then together they monitor compliance in the port. So they monitor that both the private sector and the public sector are following the rules and regulation in that port. And the magic happens when you bring in law enforcement into that mix. So there's some real consequences when there are people not following those rules essentially. And we have a brilliant example from Nigeria, where the Nigerian government has put this in place. They have a team standing ready to intervene in real time as infractions happens. So this is really not only a way to improve surveillance and monitoring and compliance, it's also a way to really prevent corruption from happening in the port, because these guys can actually intervene on the spot and do stint operations. And that has been a game changer in Nigeria. And we also see this model in other parts of the world, but this is something we really promote and push governments to invest in. And it's not that easy to get government agencies to collaborate. So I think one effort here is excellent by you guys. The World Customs Organization and International Ports and Harbour Associations have done a guideline on how you can actually promote that collaboration, how you practically can collaborate between port authorities and customs. So I think this is really what we need to build on. Then my final point, I think you also mentioned something about how do we protect the champions on the ground from violence, harassment, and so on. And I think very fundamentally, you need to have that very senior level buy-in in your initiatives as you drive change. In Nigeria, we had the blessing of the vice president from fairly early on. And that was quite important because then you can escalate. You can make sure that there is transparency around these incidents, and you can also make sure that there are consequences when individuals and these, as we call them, champions of change, are being threatened or harassed and so on. So having that buy-in and solid backing from senior government is really key for any kind of progress, but it's really key to also do no harm and protect the individuals on the ground in the port.
Thank you, Martin. Jamie, what recommendations or considerations would you suggest?
Yeah, thank you. I think a lot has already been covered. I don't want to cover that ground again, but I agree fully with David and Martin. I think first of all, it's important to come back to this point you raised, David, about the diversity of organized criminal groups around the world. I mean, we're speaking about them as if they're homogeneous, but what we're seeing is there's such a diversity of the levels of infiltration they have around the world, the levels of capture. And I think a lot of people in this room are familiar with this concept of syndromes of corruption. I think there's also, in terms of organized criminal groups, measurements and typologies. There's a very useful new study coming out by two scholars called Sparra and Fanucci. And they're actually really looking to develop a different typology that differentiates between the levels of infiltration that organized criminal groups have, and then understand, according to that, the kinds of corruption that they can actually engage in. So I think I mentioned that because I think it's very important to tailor different recommendations to different settings, to different contexts. I think before any recommendations are really, or any integrity measures are enacted, I think coming back to your point about a risk assessment, I think a multi-stakeholder risk assessment that's bringing in, again, perspectives from the anti-corruption community, but also from law enforcement about the level of physical threat that could be there. I think in terms of specific integrity measures, you can kind of classify them into two broad categories. One is preventative, and that's really coming back to what David said about trying to kind of already prevent the organized criminal group from infiltrating your organization in any sustained way, in building those networks. And that really does come down to like lifestyle checks. It can come down to Martin's point about training. I think there's a very good practice from Belgium where they actually used simulation-based trainings where they really involved actors simulating organized criminal groups. And this was found to be very effective. In terms of, when the problems got too bad and when they have infiltrated, then we can speak about reactive measures. I think in that regard, the one I'd like to kind of focus on is whistleblower protection. This is something TI, of course, kind of pioneers around the world. We have ALACs, we have advocacy and legal aid centers all around the world. I think whistleblower protection is crucial, but it, again, would need to be enhanced because often we see it as a sort of an internal measure. This is like maybe a customs administration has their own whistleblowing mechanism. But as I outlined, the risks and in accordance with a do no harm approach are quite broad here. They're quite strong. And we're thinking the kind of generally whistleblowers in any context face a risk of reprisal. But the reprisal that organized criminal groups can enact in the form of violence is somewhat more severe. So I think when we talk about an enhanced whistleblower protection scheme, we need to look in bringing in elements of witness protection. I mean, I'm speaking about guarantees for the safety, surveillance of the people who make those complaints or those reports, possibly rotating them to different areas where they could be safe. So along these lines, I think there's two ways of approaching it from the preventative and a reactive angle. Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. And lastly, over to you, Christina. What recommendations do you have for us?
Thanks. I think a key part of any response really depends on a diversity of data, engagement, and response from across of sectors of society. And this is actually also recognized by our Global Organized Crime Index, which highlights the space for civil society to cooperate as a key indicator of resilience. And at the GI, a core part of our work is done through our Resilience Fund that I've also mentioned up front, where we've worked to support civil society initiatives in over 55 countries around the world to build better community-level responses. And this is not a program specifically designed to address responses in customs or various port settings, but I think it does offer some general lessons that can be also applied here. So, for example, where trust in law enforcement is low, bringing together civil society, journalists, and state officials around a common threat or a problem can actually build some of that trust. And what can civil society do, and what have we seen it do? So reducing the violence through activities like mediating between violent groups, supporting the community, policing, social inclusion and skills, but also working with at-risk youth, for example. And what I can say here is that a broader range of measures need to be taken to build integrity in society and to safeguard customs sector from violence and corruption associated with organized crime. Alongside better security and technology and enforcement cooperation, community actors and civil society allow the sector and the state to build a better understanding of organized crime, how it operates, the methodologies and modus operandi, and what can be done to ensure more effective responses which can stand up to the corruption that undermines existing efforts. The best security systems are undermined where there is corruption. We've made that very clear, and that's why really integrity is key. To underpin that transparency in strong institutions, checks and balances, and cultural change is needed in terms of strengthening that transparency. I don't want to repeat what has already been said, but I think a couple of key issues that were mentioned were the unified task forces that really could make a difference, building capacity, the risk assessments, and sorry to go back to the environmental crime example, but I think here the risk assessments would really be key because, as mentioned, sort of the mix between legal and illegal flows and the fact that environmental commodities are often mingled, they're not at the center of attention of customs officials and port authorities, actually. And we really observed this limited capacity and knowledge among the officials of what's actually an illicit good. So risk assessments here would really help. I think attention should also be given to the interaction between the port, the local criminal markets, and corruption networks. So it would make sense to strengthen the links between private sector, public authorities, and law enforcement imports by encouraging more permanent security networks to clarify who's actually responsible for what. And then periodically also review that security and the risks and the emerging threats. I think it's really key to stay up to date with the emerging threats and how are they changing and how can a port react to that. And it's really, I mean, we've been talking a lot about ports, but crime is not confined to the port, so looking at the broader picture is really important. And one last thing which has come up through our research is crime liaison officers in ports. So a port-specific liaison security network enabled by national legislation and by the private sector in this port can support investigations on the supply chains of illicit trades. It would also help if each port had a crime port liaison officer, an expert really on organized crime, crime prevention and security, whose role would be to network and to keep contacts with local authorities, with the police, customs and prosecution officers, and to be also the focal point for international relations and partners with other ports and other cross-border policing authorities. I think these liaison officers could then be linked up with their peers and they could exchange and really also develop networks in a specific region. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Christina. A lot of very good points there. I have questions, but obviously my voice is not going to last much longer. So I think we have just over 15 minutes left. So maybe if you can all help me save my voice, if you've got some good questions. I think we have a microphone. I'll take 2 questions, like 3 questions, and we'll see if we have time after the. Sitting next to Harold.
Thank you very much for an extremely interesting discussion and presentations. My name is Molly Lee and I work at SIDA, Swedish Development Cooperation Agency. I have a question for Martin. If I understood you correctly, but I might have been mistaken, but you mentioned that many of the companies that had been compromised, many of them had proper anti-corruption policies and they had surveillance and security measures and whistleblower systems, etc. But you also said that that wasn't enough and they needed to build integrity further in their companies. If that is what you said, I was curious to find out, what was missing and what would you see, needed for them to have an even more robust integrity system. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try to spread across the room so you're going to get your exercise. Could we come over here, please?
Thank you very much. I come from Taiwan, and I'm now working at faculty member of university. So I'm actually from theoretical point of view, but I have a real problem right now. I seek for your advice. We have pigeon racing. You know pigeon racing? Pigeon is like a bird. Now in Taiwan, there's a serious problem out there. It's controlled by organized crime. And the serious problem is that the bird, 2 years ago, 65,000 pigeons was shipped to the sea. And the raising, the pigeon came from the ocean, only 3 survived. The other were dead or died. So I work closely with a prosecutor in Taiwan. Well, Taiwan is a very good place, but this is a negative case. I'm here probably 6. That's one of my purpose to come here. I'm not sure whether I could get some advice, because if this issue exposed to international society, I'm not sure whether there's a chance to solve the problem. This organized crime problem there. This animal, this pigeon was so crucial kind of treatment, because the regulation is something like that, is that there's only one chance for pigeons to have the rights. There's the regulation. And they only allowed children pigeon to make competition. And after the competition, they no longer need the bird, need the pigeon. So it's kind of very crucial competition. I think so far as I knew, there's only this kind of a rule of the game in Taiwan. But the other country, might be more healthy. So I'm here to get advice whether you could give me some suggestions to solve the problem there. Innocent pigeons. According to my knowledge, probably until now, more than 1 million children pigeon die innocently. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And if you wouldn't mind, over the other side. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Mike Baker. I work for Ecarus. Tomorrow we're organizing a workshop on corruption as an enabler of organized crime at 3:30, and very much looking forward to see you there, hopefully. And one of my questions is, corruption has a really strong human factor to it, and what if we remove this human factor and invest in technology? For example, automized ports. To which extent do you think this could be an effective approach to dealing with this issue?
Thank you. So I think the first question was very clearly for you, Martin, to clarify a little bit more on the whistleblower systems and the responses needed.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. So just to clarify, as a member in our network, we put certain requirements on companies. Our mission is really to raise the bar on compliance and anti-corruption in the shipping industry. And if you do not improve your compliance standards in our network as a member, we have the option to kick you out. So we have a bit of a stick, but we also have a carrot. So we provide a number of tools to companies that they can take and implement internally, such as training for captains, due diligence platform for third parties, and so on. So the whole theory of change is that business needs to walk the talk, and they need to improve on how they address compliance, anti-corruption internally, but of course also in their external relations with governments and so on. So captains has to be trained on how you actually say no to corruption and the tactics of that. So that means that the companies we work with, they all have a certain level of compliance standards in their organization at various levels. But what is missing in this case is essentially the collaboration with the port side. Because even though you have compliance and you have surveillance on the ship and the vessel, you're entering a port in a foreign country where governance may be weaker. And then you're on your own, because that port authority or that private terminal, they don't have the kind of surveillance needed to protect that huge ship coming in. So I think that was the point I was after, that you need these platforms, or at least standards, and also room for collaboration between the port side and the ship side to actually address these security challenges in the port facility. Does that answer? Yeah.
Thanks, Martin. I think the question that we had, was a very specific case in Taiwan with the pigeon industry. You had provided us, Christina, a similar sort of in-depth look at a particular issue with abalone. I guess each case is very different, but are there certain sort of things that could be lessons for, particularly from the wildlife crime side of things that could be useful?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think we also spoke about this yesterday very briefly. Unfortunately, I am not familiar with the pigeon case, but happy to talk again also afterwards on this. I think one point I wanted to make about the tech question that also came. I think tech, and actually I was quite surprised, we didn't really talk about the role of technology that much today, and it's a key question. There are lots of opportunities that tech brings in taking this human element out, but I would just say maybe it's not the one-size-fits-all solution either, because it actually can create a lot of resentment across workers that could then actually also sell their access and their or know-how on how to access the technology in a port system. So I think it brings a lot of opportunities in terms of efficiency, in terms of security, etc. But there is sort of a second side to it as well.
Does any of our other panelists want to respond to the question on tech?
Yeah, I'll, just a point on tech. I think it's a very valid point. We're seeing automated ports, as you well know. We're seeing automated vessels, so carrying thousands of containers across international seas, virtually unmanned. So it's definitely a step in the right direction. Also, the investment that's being made in securing the actual containers that convey goods. So there's quite a few different companies out there now which are implementing technology to signal an alarm if a container is opened without authority. Also, the bolt system that seals the container is typically made of metal, making that electronic and being able to be tracked by GPS. So it deviates from its set course, and again, it triggers an alarm and initiates a response activity. So I think the thing to consider with automation is that it's definitely headed in the right direction, but I honestly think it's still quite some years away before it gets to a point where it eliminates enough of the vulnerabilities in the supply chain to be effective. So, mitigating risks in supply chains, like anywhere else, is about vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are weaknesses. So whilst automation minimises the weaknesses in that particular pocket, it does create weaknesses elsewhere, and it creates opportunities and vulnerabilities elsewhere. So in summary, I think it's definite, watch this space. It's definitely moving in the right direction. But realistically, it's probably some years away before you can, take a breath and shift your focus elsewhere.
Maybe I could just add very briefly to build on your points. I think we did also look at automation in this paper, which I spoke about. And you're completely right. I mean, I think it can be very effective at addressing that face-to-face element. But that's really more focused on the ground levels, like customs agents, the borders agents. And I think what's important to note, and again, this comes back to it not being a silver bullet, is a lot of this corruption actually occurs much higher up in the food chain with high-level customs officials, with high-level officials. So it would never really capture that area. I think that's why you need probably more systematic thinking approaches. Yeah.
Thank you. I see we have just maybe a little time for one more question. I don't think I asked from this section, so sorry. Yes, in the front.
Thank you. Emmanuel Ansa from Ghana, TI. I'm coming from the end of a prosecution of offenders, particularly high-level offenders, because the discussion seemed to be focusing on customs officials and all of these people. But in most countries, customs officials are not appointed there just by themselves, especially the top ones. They are all government supported. So if it happens that people in government are involved, isn't it time we started looking at a global body like the International Human Rights Court for such situations? Because when you take it back to the same country, the same officials who have empowered the customs people to do these things are going to oversee. They know how to kill it or to maybe sacrifice a younger official, and then it never gets changed. So that side of things, I think that we should be starting to look at a global kind of forum for looking at these serious offenses, especially with the ones with the drugs. Because the long-term effects of some of these things is worse than even the wars that we're talking about. If you take about the cocaine, maybe it's 100 kilos of cocaine and its effect on the young people, on people who are using it, I think that it's just the same as a war crime. And why would we focus on war crimes and not look at these things as well? So I think we should be looking at the prosecution side, lobbying for a global body to see to this, especially when it involves high-level political people. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a good question, certainly for the judicial and prosecutorial levels, which we may need to bring in other colleagues on that. But I think the point that you make about the high-level political interference and there's an inherent threat in that as well. I think, Martin, you talked about the fact that the corruption is happening at every level, and those networks are very powerful and organized. Jamie, you've talked about physical threat, but there's political interference and other threatening threats to our lives and livelihoods, in addition to the physical, and often that comes with immense physical, political power behind it. So I think we just have a couple more minutes left, so I don't know if anybody here would like to just take up the gentleman's point here.
Yeah, no, I think it's an interesting comment. I can just say, in our work, we don't have exactly the same scenario, of course, but we do have survived many elections where we operate, and an election comes with new power, of course, and new inspectors, new head of customs and whatnot. And sometimes it's bad news. Sometimes, as I said in my introduction here, sometimes you have the same inspectors reappearing or the same head of the agency reappearing. And for us, it's a constant kind of battle, and having this collective action model where you involve civil society, you involve global and local supply chain partners, and you also involve some of the champions in government and try and use them to actually monitor these changes and say, well, we don't think this is actually going in the right direction, or here are actually the incidents that we've just seen based on this new government entering into force of this new head. So I think putting the light on these incidents and having a mechanism to make them transparent, even the media can be very helpful here. So just having that kind of infrastructure, like a multi-stakeholder platform, a collective action platform, is one way to really protect the progress that you have achieved and sustain that over elections and so forth. So just to add.
Thank you. Yes.
Just maybe to pick up on one point that Martin also just said, I think, we see not only lack of political will sometimes to implement things and change, but really this high-level protection that we've also talked about. And one approach that we're taking now is also focus more on exposés and really in-depth investigations on how elite protection and corruption drives and enables organized crime in different markets. And the idea here is really to increase the cost and the risks of these actors to be involved in this and add some scrutiny at their names and their companies and associated business on to the public record and create a little bit of change like this. So this could also be maybe one way to add to the response.
Thank you. I saw you had.
Yeah, just very briefly, I think it is a great point, and I think what it comes down to is your point is that we shouldn't take a wholly national approach to these issues. They are fundamentally transnational. What you're proposing is called on by many activists and many prosecutors, the establishment of something like an international anti-corruption court. I think, 30 years ago, there could have been a lot more momentum towards that. I think we obviously live in a different geopolitical climate. But I think what's important is to in the meantime, to look at different mechanisms that are, worked on by World Customs Organization, the Global Initiative, the network. And I think those are kind of honing in on that transnational aspect to ensure that when there isn't political will at the national level, there are other actors that can step up.
Thank you. I think maybe on...
Sorry, on an unrelated note, I just wanted to say thanks to our moderator. She thought I've forgotten, but I haven't. It's actually her birthday today. So just wish her a happy birthday. Andrea, thank you.
All right. Thank you all, everyone. As I said, we recognise it was a choice to come here this morning, and so we're very grateful that you took that, and hopefully this was interesting to you. As we see, it's a very complex problem. It always is, but I think perhaps this last point also, the fact that it's we're talking about global supply chains. There's so many different actors involved. It means there's opportunities also for so many different actors to be part of the resolution. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.